We have the green light. We are ready to go live. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, the audience that we can't see yet. Good morning to our colleagues who have accepted to speak to this event. This event is going to be talking about what I think is right now the hottest topic in town, the CSRD. Very timely event, by the way, as the trilogues, this wonderful European invention, have just started. And I think the next one is now scheduled for 7th of April. So we're really entering the final stage of the negotiations, a final stage that can nonetheless sometimes last a little bit of time. And to discuss these matters, I think I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic slate of speakers. First of all, we've got the world expert on the CSRD, Eric van der Plaats. Very nice to see you again, Eric, and thank you for joining the conversation today. I'm delighted to welcome as well Stanislas Potier, who is Senior Advisor to the General Management of Amundi. We have with us also Anne-Hélène Moncellato. Very nice to see you again, Anne-Hélène. Independent Director. She's with ECODA and with the Audit and Risk Committee Chair of Euronav and Genfit. So a great insight from businesses. My dear colleague Rami Fegali is with us as well. Rami is the Vice Chair of our Sustainability Policy Group at Accountancy Europe. And we are also joined by Philippe Gregor. Thank you, Philippe, to give us a view from civil society. Philippe is the head of responsible companies at Frank Bold. So thank you all for joining. Without any further ado, I think we should really start the conversation. But in a way, before we start, Eric, I would very much like to give you the floor to maybe update us on where the starting trialogue actually stand and what's your view on the CSRD. Eric, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you, Olivier. Good morning, everybody. I cannot see the audience, which is always a bit strange. I'm talking to my computer, but anyway, that's where we are. It's very efficient to do it. That's the upside. Yeah, before I give you the update, I wanted to make 3 comments, actually. The first comment is a kind of disclaimer. I'm a commission official, but that does not mean that everything that I say, or even anything that is here for that matter, is the official commission position. You know, there's a difference between the two, and I just wanted to emphasize that. Then I think just to raise the awareness of the participants to the extent they don't know already, we have started a legislative process, and in that process, the Commission is more of an intellectual, honest broker of political agreement, because it's the Council and the European Parliament who call the shots. Let's say this part of the process. I think that's also important to be aware of. And the third point is totally unrelated to the first 2, is that I want to thank actually Accountancy Europe for not only organizing this webinar, but also their constructive role in the EFRA governance reform, and as well as the funding that they have provided to EFRA so as to be able to host the sustainability reporting pillar. I think it is important for people to know that. So now getting back to the current state of play of the negotiations, well, there has not been so much negotiations until now because we only had 1 political trilogue, and the first political trilogue is not immediately delving into technical details. That will come in the next 2 political trilogues that are scheduled. But nevertheless, there's some kind of takeaways from the first trilogue. Well, both the Council and the Parliament stressed how important the CSRD is in the bigger context of the Green Deal and climate change, and they are both very keen on achieving political agreement very rapidly, actually by the end of June. That's their kind of indicative time frame, and that would be under the French presidency. And personally, I think they're right, because the fact that we have negotiations does not mean that climate change is put on hold or on pause or a loss of biodiversity. You know, those real phenomena are going on and they will not wait for kind of political discussions. And I think the sooner we would achieve a political agreement on the CSRD and we can move forward on developing a, let's call it sustainability reporting language, the better it is. Other points mentioned by both Council and Parliament was a desire to protect SMEs from an unnecessary administrative burden coming from the sustainability reporting disclosure requirements. Scope of application, should the CSRD be applied also to non-EU companies? That's the point that the Parliament raised, and it may come up in the discussions that we will have later on. And a point, and that will definitely come because this is the Council of Europe, the audit regime and whether there should be a strict separation between those providing the audit opinion on the financial statements and those who could provide assurance on the sustainability report. So those were the main points that were mentioned. And I think the main takeaway for me is the real strong desire to achieve a political agreement shortly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you for the thanks. Actually, pretty unusual that we get thanked like that. So always nice to hear. I think I can't agree more with you that climate is not waiting. Unfortunately, it's not been waiting for the past 40 years where things have very significantly deteriorated. So let's see and let's hope indeed, as you do, that policymakers will agree by June. But before we talk about actually, the timeline, I would like to pick up on the point that you've made, Eric, and start, the discussion with one of the most controversial points in the debate on the one hand in the Parliament and in the Council on the scope of the CSRD and the comment that you made on SMEs. And, in line with your comment on climate, I think the scope should be defined with the objective of meeting the goals. I don't think administrative burden should be the driver here, personally. I think, climate is not bothered by administrative burdens. What is the right scope to get the right effect is my question. And can I perhaps start asking this question to companies and ask Anne-Hélène to come into the play and share your views on this issue of the scope? Anne-Hélène, what do you think?
Thank you, Olivier. I think it's a very relevant question, and I sympathize wholeheartedly with the objective of not burdening SMEs. At the same time, and I totally agree with you, climate change is not bothered by administrative burden. And even if we discuss criteria, what would be the idea of discussing criteria on a financial basis as opposed to discussing criteria on an impact basis? If we take, for example, all those companies regarding new technologies, let's take an example, non-fungible tokens. So there are some number of startups in that field. There are still small companies. However, their impact on climate due to their energy consumption is proportionately very high. Should these companies, because there are still startups and qualifying as SMEs, be exonerated from the CSRD and reporting on their energy consumption, on their energy efficiency, on what they do to reduce their environmental imprint? So definitely, I think it's a very good question, and we need to take into account the fact that if we discuss non-financial matters, then we must take into account for any threshold that would be considered the non-financial impact of these companies. So I agree that probably some very small companies should be exonerated from that, but at the same time, let's be considerate with respect to what threshold we put in place, not purely financial. Very quick word, meaning SMEs, but also should it be extended to private companies? And here I think there is a topic which is very much discussed currently, which is the divestment of bad assets, of dirty assets. And we need to be to pay a lot of attention regarding the fact that if we go too strong on listed companies only, then we will have, and we currently have, a flurry of divestment of bad, dirty assets, and then this will make us meet the goal. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Hélène. So if I understand you well, the driver should be risk actually more than size, right? Very good. Stanislas, can I throw you the ball on this issue of the scope? I mean, what's your view from your perspective?
Yes, good morning to all. I think this is a very important question. I would agree with Anne-Hélène, but from another point of view, that if you exclude SMEs from these obligations, these reporting obligations, then you might, as a consequence, exclude them from the green finance. So if you want them to have access to investors, to have access to new ways of financing transition, climate transition, greening up the economy, you really must embark them on these requirements. So it has to be simple, of course. It has to be manageable by small size corporates. And I think also financials should play a role in helping these SMEs getting on board, you know. But I really think that they should report on this. Otherwise, they will be excluded from the financial market. And the other point I fully agree with is this: we have to be very cautious with the segmentation between listed corporates and private equity. And we can solve, I think, this problem by really having strong requirements on private equity firms and private equity funds. That way, they should, and they are in a position to do it in their relationships to the issuers, to the corporate. So I think we should require them to really report on this issue and to report on climate. This is very important because we have witnessed in the last years some movements of cleaning some portfolios just by selling assets, and then we lose the assets. We can't even assess and control what's going on afterwards. So this is also a very key point.
Thank you. So very interesting comment. Arriving at the same goal, but from different angles. Very interesting. Rami, you've got big clients, you've got small clients. So what's your take on the scope discussion here? What do you think?
Well, it has been said. I think the issue is an issue for the whole economy, not only for the large companies. So SME are part of the economy, and they are concerned by the issue. That's all. And even if you look at the regulation itself, even if you regulate large companies and financial institutions, then indirectly you are asking a smaller company to provide information, and we see it in financial regulation. You have the SFDR, the so-called Pillar 3 for banks that are requesting banks to provide information on their SMEs. So what they will do, they will ask the SME to provide the information. So I think it's a bit an illusion to think that we are exempting them from doing the things. I would rather do it differently, acknowledging that they are part of the landscape and seeing what should be done and when it should be done to help them, to embark them, and to help them to be part of the game, including providing them with simple tools. We can discuss simplicity, but the voluntary standard, I think it's a good idea. But sooner than later, because if you wait at the end, it will be too late. And also support, financial support, human support, so that they know what to do. And this is the bulk of the issue, I think, on this respect.
Thank you, Rami. So a call for simplicity, and I hope Eric has recorded the call of the accountants for simplicity, not something we're always associated with. So next time you thank us, Eric, it will be for our calls for simplicity, I hope. And you will have noted that there is already a question for you in the chat, so you can prepare your answer while we hear from civil society on the scope. The question, Eric, is what is your take from the European Commission perspective on the EP's position to exclude listed SMEs from the scope? So it's like at school, you've got 5 minutes to prepare, and we're going to be listening to Philippe's views on scope. SMEs included, excluded. Tell us, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier. And I should also add a disclaimer in the before I start, and that is that I'm part of the project task force at EFRAG, which is developing the draft standards or working papers with the draft standards, and I'll be included in the governance structure that you have so kindly supported, as mentioned by Eric. And then brings me to my first point that I wanted to say, and that is it's less of a question who shall be included, but how good the standards will be. Because if they're good, we don't need to be worried about who's included in the legislation. And I would very much like to echo Rami's points that SMEs will be included indirectly. I mean, that will be the trickle-down effect, and actually including them in the regime, having them, being part of the system, may actually make it easier for them, because the standards would then clarify what they need to disclose, and we would limit this kind of trickle-down effect, and we would make it clear to them what they really need to follow, and so on and so forth. And the point on the need to focus on the implementation and getting not only small companies but also large companies to understand what this is all about is a major task which I think we are not paying enough attention to. But more directly to your question, so first of all, and that's the explanation for my slip, is the subsidiaries. It's not just the SMEs, it's also the subsidiaries which may be exempted. And the same issue, what is sustainability reporting? Well, first, there is a connection to green finance that was mentioned, I believe, by Stanislas. And the other is that it is a powerful management tool that helps companies to navigate this massive transformation which is ahead of us. The war in Ukraine, as terrible as it is showing us clearly how precarious our position is with regard to fossil fuels, even beyond climate change. And there's a unique moment of realization across the society and in the corporate sector. We need to do something quickly. Everybody needs to do something quickly, but nobody really knows what. And this is where the CSRD and the standards which are being developed will play a major role. So the more we can include companies into this, the more we can help. And then very quickly on listed SMEs. I don't really understand why they will be excluded in the European Parliament's proposal. There's no logic to it. High risk SMEs definitely need to be included because they are at risk. They are exposed to all these risks regarding the transformation. Of course, this kind of is then translated to the investors and so on and so forth. And then on the subsidiaries, if you just let the subsidiaries to only report data to their parent companies, then we're missing on this effect of like thinking through the future, getting them to modernize and transform as well, rather than just waiting for the parents to tell them what to do. And this has a major role at the level of especially smaller national economies, which are, let's say, filled with these subsidiaries of foreign parent companies. So in a way, it's not a question who shall be included or excluded in the obligation, but rather who is to be included or excluded in the transformation. Who's to succeed, where the money should go, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to turn that, let's say, perspective around a little bit. That's it.
A very, very good point, Philippe. Unfortunately, on your reference to the dramatic war in Ukraine, the reactions I tend to see is that we do everything we can to continue business as usual. And as a result, we've never subsidized the use of fossil fuels to the levels that we're doing so now. So I hope you're right, but that's not what I see right now. Before, I think, throwing back the floor to Anne-Hélène, who has raised her hand, can I return to you a question that you actually raised, Philippe? I think your comment on, it's not a matter of scope, it's a matter of how good the standards will be, is actually a very good question. But as you are part of the task force, maybe I'm going to throw back the question to you. Do you think we're going to have good standards? And echoing, Rami's call for simplicity, do you think we're going to have simple standards? A yes or no question before I throw back the floor to Anne-Hélène. Tough one, huh? But you raised it.
No, they will be excellent. I mean, it's a tough journey, but we will end up with, I think, something really, really good.
Thank you. Anne-Hélène, you raised your hand. A comment, please.
Yes, I wanted to share another comment regarding SMEs or no SMEs included. So I made my position clear. I think they should be included broader than just listed companies. And maybe if we want to define a criteria, let's put the criteria on impact rather than financial figures. However, I believe that it would be obviously better that they be totally included. Why? Because when you're a large company or a medium-sized company or whatever company, you've got to measure your scope 3. And if you have to measure your scope 3, then you're looking to emissions in addition to your own emissions. And the difficulty is to have access to information which is reliable and quickly. So obviously, if we include SMEs into the scope of the CSRD, it will allow all other companies to put together a better, reliable reporting and more quicker than if we leave that to voluntary application, because then it's a regulation. They have to apply it, as opposed to the customer that's asking them for that information, and then there will be less pressure to put together the information in a reliable format for all those reporting. So overall, it will enable a quicker application and a better impact if this is what we all want to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Hélène. Rami, it's on SMEs as well, because I would like to move the discussion to non-EU companies as regard the scope. There's a great question on that in the chat. But if you've got a comment on SMEs,
yes, on SME and briefly, Philippe mentioned that if the standard is right, then it will work. And I think it's important because if the standard is right, and then it can have a virtuous effect for the SMEs. So instead of being an administrative burden, it can be a transformation tool in a way. So, and again, I think the simplicity issue is going to be key there, but there's also a virtuous effect in the transformation aspect of SME to have in mind.
So reporting as a tool toward transformation. Thank you, Rami. Very important point, I think. Eric, you wanted to comment, and maybe after you make your comment, you could answer this question on non-EU companies. You're on mute, Eric.
Sorry, it happens all the time.
Yeah, no worries.
The question on SMEs and where the Commission stands, I think there are two dimensions here. One is what should be in the mandatory scope of the CSRD, and the second thing is what will happen in practice with SMEs in the supply chain of companies that are in the scope of the CSRD. The Commission did, as always, actually, an impact assessment, and our proposal was to include only listed SMEs. And the reason for arriving at that conclusion was that compared to the cost of a listing, the incremental cost actually of sustainability reporting would be relatively incremental for listed SMEs. So there the kind of trade-off was easier made. And of course, their access to capital, that's why they are listed. They have access to capital, and probably they have a drive anyway, irrespective of the requirement to go towards the direction of sustainability reporting and to satisfy investors. There is, of course, some proportionality in the sense that there would be SME standards, and the SMEs would come later, subject to the requirements. So that are also elements of the CSRD proposal that's important. You know, looking at it from a kind of higher level, I think if you would look at the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, you know, companies or some companies may see it as a burden that will be imposed on them, which I can understand. Others, maybe the accounting profession, may see it as a market. You know, we do create a market, of course, for reporting and assurance services. Whereas others like myself would see it as a possibly European Sustainability Reporting Standard as an instrument to actually achieve policy objectives. And ultimately, and I said this before, if the ESRS would become a kind of established reporting language through which companies could show how they handle material sustainability related impacts, risk and opportunities, that would be fantastic, you know, and you would have a kind of common basis and comparability. So ultimately, like financial reporting, maybe it should become a kind of reporting language. That's what I had to say on the SMEs, and well, again, reiterating that even if you're outside the mandatory scope of the CSRD, you will be captured in practice if you're an SME in the supply chain of a company. And I don't know how they will deal with that through contractual arrangements or indirectly or directly imposing on SMEs in the supply chain to also apply an SME standard on sustainability reporting. I don't know.
Thank you for that, Eric. I'm going to ask you also about non-EU companies, but to give you 2 minutes to think about non-EU companies and prepare your reply, I will answer the question that you raised actually on how the accountancy profession sees non-financial reporting, sustainability reporting. We don't see it as a market opportunity. We see it as a social responsibility. We see it as the one thing that this profession needs to contribute to the transformation of the economy. So this is a public interest duty, I think, more than anything else. So what about, I see you're back on mute, but you're going to unmute yourself and maybe give, shed a little bit of light for us on this whole discussion on non-EU companies. That's also related to scope. So should they be included? How far should they be included? How will we?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's for the co-legislators. Sorry, Olivier. As I said, it's for the co-legislators to decide. It was not in our proposal. We did look at this, and the arguments in favor and against are all very intuitive, no? If we impose, let's use that, a kind of reporting burden on European companies, why should other companies outside the EU who also export to the EU not be subject to the same standards? So that's a very fair point, and that's where the European Parliament amendment is coming from. When we looked at this, when we did the impact assessment, well, there's certain issues here. It's the extraterritorial thing, so we would impose actually the requirements on non-EU established companies. Do we have a legal basis for that, really? And how can we enforce that? Because those companies are not established in our jurisdiction. And then really down to earth is, do we have the data to identify which companies of outside the EU would be in scope? And it is always surprising how difficult it is to find the numbers of, let's say, US companies, exactly what their turnover in the EU is, you know, and they're all kind of issues. Personally, I do really understand where the European Parliament is coming from, because it has a kind of fairness thing in it. And maybe, hopefully, we have to rely on the Brussels effect here too, that whatever we do in Europe will trickle down outside the EU over time. That may well be. So that is what I have to say. But ultimately, of course, as I said, it's the co-legislators who will decide.
I think Philippe has kindly volunteered in the chat to respond a difficult question on the materiality assessment for SMEs of the non-sector neutral standards. So I'll let you do that maybe in the chat, because I would like to move on the conversation. Very good conversation with such a great panel, it's easy. On now talking about the timeline, because that's also another point that brought up some discussion. What do you think, from your respective perspective, should be the reporting timeline? When do we have to apply and enforce this for large companies and for SMEs? Is there a difference here? Feels like I'm going to start with companies again. Anne-Hélène, do you want to pick up this question?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Olivier. I think the timeline, as we all stressed in the very beginning of this webcast, should be ambitious, but not to the point that it will, avoid reporting quickly. However, I think we can have, certain mechanism which will enable us to achieve both aims, meaning there can be one timeline for larger mid-sized companies, one timeline for SMEs, definitely, and also there should be the possibility of first exemption for good reasons, for companies where the measurements are very complex. It's a huge effort. We could have, some possibility of exemptions, which could be with clear motives put in the reporting, and when the time frame when that information would come, and how the company has arranged to provide, for that information in the near future. And there should also be, I think, at the very beginning, some grace period, so that even for very large companies, we have at ECODA and at the French level interviewed a certain number of very large French companies, and we can see, depending on how the configuration of the company is, and especially when there are a lot of smaller subsidiaries, it's very difficult to make sure everybody will be aligned to provide reliable information. There should be this grace period where companies, although they are embarked in that journey, in that huge effort, we do not demotivate them by being, too quick, too severe. So a grace period on implementation with, for example, authorities charged with reviewing the financial and non-financial reporting, being allowed to provide comments, to provide illustrations, best practices that they see as part of their review, so that it all drives everybody, in the same direction to provide good numbers, good qualitative reporting, but still at the same time taking into account the level of efforts and investments in information system, resources, internal control, people, and so on, that all this entail. So that everybody is working in the same direction, but not, with undue pressure, which would be detrimental to really the quality of the reporting that we're looking to achieve.
So a progressive stepped approach, which you very nicely call a grace period, like that. Maybe Rami, can you react to that? I mean, because that's also, from a perspective of the accountancy profession, do you see the opportunity for, building up through a step-by-step approach on reporting? Then we'll give the floor to Stanislas after that. Rami.
Yes, I think a step-by-step approach or progressive implementation. This was my wording. I think it's a good way forward. I think the other thing that is important is simplicity. Again, I think the timing. The issue we have with timing is that we have two conflicting priorities to deal with. One is to be ambitious enough, and we know that the clock is ticking, and we have all the reason to be ambitious, and we have to be ambitious. But at the same time, and we can see that the expectation on the information that is provided by company is really growing. So it's going to be very important to provide credible information. And we need to cope with these two conflicting priority. But the second one is very important because at the end, if you put a very short deadline and the company are not able to produce credible, correct information, then we will still have a big problem. And the way we can solve this, I think, is one, to think about simplicity again. And I can make a comment on the European regulation. To what extent is beautiful in a mathematical manner, complete, well designed. And if you look at the taxonomy, you can characterize it like this. If you look at the work of the EFRAG as well, it is a beautiful work, a complete, but I think it's too much in a short period of time. I know it will change, but the more than 1,000 data points that we have currently in the working paper of the EFRAG standard is certainly too much, and we need to think about how to make it as simple as possible, not simpler, and also how to provide for progressive implementation to be able to cope with the issue.
Thank you, Rami. So I'm sure that Eric has actually noted that in the space of 37 minutes, the accountancy profession has called 3 times for simplicity, okay? And I think I will hope that the Commission does the same thing at times. And I suppose behind the simplicity point, the comment I would add, before giving you the floor, Stanislas, is that it's also a matter of efficiency. I think we're in a typical situation where the best is the enemy of the good. And I think the more we're going to ask, the more we're going to seek for perfection, the less efficient we will be. And climate will not wait, as you said, Eric. Stanislas, you wanted to react.
Yeah, thank you, Olivier. For a fourth time, I would also call for simplicity. And as you've very rightly said, it's also a matter of efficiency. Progressivity, of course, fair enough. But we have to go quickly now. For a very simple reason is that financials have already been asked to report on all this. If they don't have the raw material, the raw data coming from issuers, from corporates, then we really have something wrong. And that's the case today. So, of course, investors, asset owners, managers, banks do need these reporting to also do a good job. And at the same time, we also have some sort of competition in norms and regulatory frameworks coming from public authorities, public bodies, but also from the market and from private bodies, alliances. You know that IFRS, with its new body ISSB, are already working also on a climate framework. They will be done with it by the end of the year. They're also talking to EFRAG. I hope and I think that we get something consistent. But if we don't go quick enough, at least big corporates will apply some other standards, and afterwards they will come and tell Europe, come on, we already have something working, something simple, so please don't bother us with these new requirements. So I think that it's a matter of Europe playing its role and having its own frameworks with its own ideas and agenda, and that's why we have to deliver quite quickly. And maybe on the progressive issue, EFRAG has, and CSRD of course, have a broad scope, a generic ESG scope. We might maybe have specific requirements on climate and focus on that for some time, because again, on all the climate agenda, we have very little time to produce data and to change our mindset and the way corporates really set their strategies and how they are going to decarbonize their business models and all this. So we really have to put all this in place in the coming 2-3 years, no more. And maybe also the method applied by ISSB, saying that okay, they are going to focus first on climate and then they will see the rest, might also be an option. So maybe we could be more demanding on climate part of CSRD and EFRAG, and maybe a bit more progressive and less demanding on some other aspects.
Thank you very much, Stanislas. Very interesting insight, actually, and different light on simplicity and progressivity, I would say. Philippe, do you want to add any comment to that before we give the floor to Eric to draw some, to share his notes taking, actually?
Yeah, but I would like to thank you, Olivier. So, I mean, it's already too late now. We shouldn't waste any more time in this regard. And I believe that the most, let's say, progressive, if I may say so, agreement between the Council and the Parliament, which is on the table, is the year 2024 as the date from which companies should start gathering the data and actually reporting or disclosing them in 2025. So from now on, the disclosure is 3 years in future, which gives ample time for everyone to kind of get acquainted with the standards and so on and so forth. Of course, it's paramount that the standards are developed as soon as possible. And I think that there's one perspective that is rarely mentioned in the public debate, and it's really, really important. And that is that there is a distinction in the standards and in the design of the legislation as such between the hard data that companies need to start gathering, that's the hard obligation, and then the disclosure of companies' policies, targets, their assessment of risks, and so on and so forth, which is by design, by definition, by its nature, I wouldn't say necessarily optional, but it's not such a hard obligation. It's just a transparency on how company thinks through these issues. So if you look at the climate standard, I mean, many of you have seen the climate working paper, which may be intimidating with the basis for conclusions. It's a lot of pages. But if you look at the truly mandatory part, something that companies would need to start doing in 2024 is just asking for the information on the energy consumed and on GHG emissions. Well, alright, the calculation of GHG emissions scope 3 might be a little bit challenging, but that's all they need to do in year 1 in 2024. And only when reporting in 2025, they need to think about, okay, do we have targets that we can disclose? Do we have the information, and so on and so forth? And the standards are formulated in a way that they say, well, disclose targets if you have any. If you have a climate transition plan, if you want to provide information on climate and transition plan, well, you need to provide this information. Doesn't mean you have to. It's just creating this kind of a standardized regime. So people tend to view the standards as this nebulous, long dangerous thing that nobody will be able to understand. And that's a real challenge. But when it comes to the mandatory aspect of it, the set of the data that companies will actually need to start looking for is actually quite simple and corresponding with the SFDR and so on and so forth.
I think you are triggering a lot of reactions, Philippe. So we'll start with Anne-Hélène. I'm sure Rami will have something to add as well if I have his previous comments in mind. So Anne-Hélène, what do you think?
Thank you, Olivier. I agree with all that has been said. Just to mention something, as a company, if you want to, putting together objectives, targets, especially regarding climate change. So we're speaking here decarbonization path. It's easy to set targets and objectives. However, if you need, and this is really, there are a lot of debates regarding directors' responsibility, managers' responsibility around that. You can't put out targets, in the open without having had a thorough discussion internally onto whether first are these targets achievable and what will be the intermediary milestones. In other words, how will you get there? And in a certain number of companies, and I mean, traditional industrial companies, sometimes the solutions are not here. So you need to thoroughly ponder where will you go, and if you do not have solutions, what will be the first intermediate steps, which will require you to review what are the low-hanging fruits. For example, can you work with startups? So hence the importance of partnerships, alliances, and so on. So it's a whole path which needs to be mapped out very thoroughly, thoughtfully, so that, year after year, you know where you will be and how you can track progress and make sure that the objective, the targets you're putting out there, be it 2030, 2040, 2050, you will be able definitely to meet those. So that's part of responsible governance. So that was just my comment. So I mean, having this to be done, early 2024 for companies who have not started that journey already, and I assume, especially considering the energy prices currently, that most of them, either have started that journey or are in the process of doing that. 2024 will come soon enough, and some others, and that would be a good surprise, will even issue that on a voluntary basis, because as rightfully pointed out, markets are requesting this and investors are requesting that information. So a lot of companies have been taking that on a voluntary basis with respect to these informations. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Anne-Hélène. And I see that Philippe is burning to answer. However, before you do so, Philippe, I'd like to see if Stanislas and Rami want to add to that. And if they don't, I will add my 2 cents.
No, nothing to add on my part, unless to stress that, yes, there is a strong requirement from investors, asset owners and asset managers, and also that we interviewed a lot of industrial corporates lately on this issue, and we were very surprised by the level of involvement in that field, and actually quite in advance. So I'm speaking of big corporates with a business model really very much affected by climate change. So, but they have a core business strategy that have fully embarked climate issue. They have carbon budgets, carbon accountancy, carbon reporting, and this is very thorough. So there is still a lot of work to do, but at least on big industrial corporates, actually they might be much more in advance than we think.
Rami?
Yes, remark, maybe just to echo, I mean, if we have to prioritize again, I think climate and biodiversity are good picks, and climate in particular. And then the issue of potentially is that a lot of things will be new, still be new. If you have KPIs, many KPIs, then you will have to produce them on a global scope and make sure that you didn't forget anything and put the process in place, etc. And for the target, and Hélène mentioned it, but there are other stuff as well. There are some stuff that to be published that are not that simple and complex and simple and straightforward than this. So then you will have to build the methodology, the norm, be transparent about it, agree, and then disclose it. And again, this is new in the making, which takes time.
Thanks, Rami. And we're gonna, I think you've got plenty of feedback, Eric and Philippe, on the view from the business side, more or less, I would say. I just like, before you share your response and comments, Philippe, I just like to throw an additional perspective in this discussion, which is the climate perspective. I mean, if I read well the IPCC report, we've got basically a small window of opportunity of 10 years to fundamentally change our business model. And we're going to start reporting in 2024 plus. So that's already, a few more years lost. And that small window of opportunities to actually help us, run a 5 to 10% chance of meeting, the 1.5 degree symbol. So that is another way of saying to avoid a catastrophe. Now, do you think, where is the balance here? Do we need less quicker, or do we need more later? Coming back to Rami's point on efficiency and simplicity, I want to see things moving. So, Philippe, tell us.
I'm not quite sure I understood the two options you presented, but I would say we need something as soon as possible, and the journey, and there was the reaction I wanted to make to Anne-Hélène's reaction, is that all the journey, that kind of figuring out what are we going to do as a company, how we are going to move, transform, and so on and so forth. That all starts with standardized data. And this is what really needs to start. I mean, it was supposed to start in 2023. Now it seems it will be 2024, and any further delay would be really catastrophic. So we need to start with standardized data. Once we know what we measure, then we can start figuring out, okay, so how our climate transition plan should look like, how should we report about it. Also, at the same time, the companies should have clarity on those major aspects, and at least in terms of disclosure on these, let's say, more strategic elements, which depend on their discretion. So there was just kind of, I was trying to echo what Anne-Hélène was saying and amplify the difference between the need to get the standardized data for the interest of the investors as well as companies as soon as possible.
And investors are nodding. So, Stanislas.
Yes, I think that we should have less quicker and then more later. It's a perfect motto. And less could focus on climate, as we already said. And we do need standardization of basics on CO2, on carbon budgets, on emissions. And if we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, if we really take seriously the last IPCC report, we know that the bulk of investments we need to do to transform economies must be done in the coming 5 years, 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's very soon. And to do the right investments, we need this information. So we really have no time to lose on climate, on basics on climate. And then we can be smarter later on. We can build, of course, the rest of extra financial framework. All this is very important, but we do need to go very quick and simple on CO2.
So it's not fast and furious, it's fast and simple, okay? So that's going to be the motto of the day, I think, fast and simple. Now, we need to move on the conversation. There are plenty of questions in the chat. Many questions actually are like, why does the parliament think what they think? And I'm not going to ask this question to Eric, because that would probably be too tough. I never appreciate it. But one of the questions that is actually asked on this slide, why does the parliament do this, or what does the parliament, think that, is around assurance? Because I'm sure investors will say, we want the data, but we want the data to be reliable, okay? So let's talk a little bit about assurance now. And it is clear that the proposal that the Commission made is introducing an EU-wide limited assurance requirement. And I'd be really interested in your views to know, what are the challenges that companies will face to meet this requirement? I'd like to hear, from the accountancy profession how ready we are, and I'd like to hear from investors and civil society what their expectations are. And then we're going to have to answer a question in the chat, which is, why the hell does the parliament think that sustainability and financial assurance should be split? And we'll give the answer to Eric, who wants to bring it back to the trilogues. So, as we're talking about assurance, shall we start with auditors? Rami, what about assurance, limited assurance on all this data?
Well, first, I think assurance is in the CSRD, and there's no, I think, debate on this. But just to remind that it's necessary because we see this information that will flow from company in the value chain, and then financial institution, and then investor, and everybody will be looking at some of assurance to ensure credibility on this. And I know that financial institutions are quite sensitive to this because they have a lot of disclose, as Stanislas mentioned, and they are bearing a kind of responsibility on the information they are receiving without being able to have an action on this responsibility. So I think it's there. It's important. Obviously, again, if you look at the end game, reasonable assurance is probably the end game. But let's focus on limited assurance now. And maybe the main message I can say now is limited assurance. It's not because it's limited assurance that's going to be easy, and the debate we're going to have now is a bit similar to the one we had before. Assurance is no magic, huh? So it's verifying that something is well done. If the thing is not well done, it will not turn something in well. So and the time necessary to produce correctly the information with all the aspect of a framework that are necessary is going to be very important even for limited assurance. And I would add, practice, you would need between the assurance provider and the company that is producing the information a time to exchange because everything will be new. So the information the assurance provider will give to the company saying, well, this is not good enough. It's not going to work. You need to adjust this. This type of exchange is also going to be very important. And we need to have time to do this. Hence, again, the debate we had previously. I can say more about how the accountancy profession is ready or not on this, Olivier. I don't know if you want me to comment now or later.
I think you can comment in a simple way.
Well, in a simple way. I'll make a comment then I don't know if it's going to simple, but maybe on the connectivity between financial and sustainable. And taking it from a very practical angle, which is a real life example in the shoes of a risk manager in a bank. And thinking about this risk manager in the bank, what does he need? What kind of information he needs to do his job? And I'm going to give the first type of information that are needed. And again, I think it's very practical. The first thing he needs to know is the company he's lending to, in what activity it is working. And when I say in what activity, the issue is many of the company have multiple type of activities, so multiple sector. So the information that is going to be important, for instance, will be the breakdown of the turnover by sector. For instance, you see, we're here in a sectorial aspect with a financial aspect as well. Then he will have to think about, yeah, okay, this company has a transition issue and a climate issue, so it have to transform its business. What is the company will do, and what does it want to do? And then the next question that comes is, how much is going to cost him? What's the investment it will need to do? And can it afford this investment? And then ask itself also, always on climate, well, there's physical risk on the company, how it's going to affect the company, and then how it's going to affect the company. What kind of asset will be at risk? What's the value of the asset? What's going to be the impact on the supply chain and the turnover? You see, all these examples are merely a mixture of sustainable climate information and sectoral information and financial information. And these are very important information. So in my view, there's no way to disentangle them. And the good thing, and I pay tribute to EFRAG again, Philippe, this kind of information are in the standard of EFRAG. If you look, they are mentioned in the working paper. But still, you see that the things are very interlinked. And I can go on like this. So actually, if you want to do the job in assurance, you need financial skills, accounting, assurance skills, audit skills, and sustainability skills. And you'll be able to have the three skills at the same time. Otherwise, the job will not be properly done. We have the ability in the accountancy profession, the use to work on a multidisciplinary approach and to mix the skills. And actually, we have already the skills right now in the large firm. The issue is going to be size. So we need to have much more of the skills together. So that's the issue we had in front of us, but we have to develop skills. And for the smaller firms, well, then we need to build from accounting and audit skills and add the sustainability skills, which is feasible, but need to be done now. And a simple comment on this, if you want to do this in a very practical manner, it's easier to build on something that exists than starting from scratch. So if you want to be ready all collectively in 2 years, 3 years time, we need to build on already what we have and do it in a constructive manner. I don't know if it was simple or not short, at least, Olivier, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm a simple guy, so, you know, I understood your point, so it must be good. And I think, unless I misunderstood, actually, you're telling us that integration between financial and non-financial and sustainable is absolutely essential to make things work. That therefore, splitting the information, the assurance on these two reports might be counterproductive to say the best, right?
It's going to be counterproductive. It's going to be a hinder to the capacity building we need to have in mind. And at the end, it will be a cost for the company because they will have to explain pretty much the same thing to multiple type of auditors, which doesn't make sense. And I mean, it wouldn't matter if we had time and we didn't say, well, we have a problem in terms of efficiency in all this. We have a timing to do. And we have all the time to adjust this, but we don't. And you think about our public interest and what we need to provide to the society. I think we need also to fix this.
Okay. I mean, I see Eric would like to react to that, but I would like to hear from companies maybe before, and Eric, you will make an even more informed comment back. And then, what's your view on this issue? So I think we're kind of mixing everything right now. on limited assurance. Is that enough to start with? When do we want to move to reasonable assurance? But also this whole issue of integration, and from integrated reporting, this point in the Parliament on splitting the financial and the sustainability assurance. Anne-Hélène.
Thank you, Olivier. Just before I respond to your question, just 2 points I wanted to make on the comments that were made initially for the benefit of Eric and Philippe. First, I think Stanislas mentioned standardization of basics in the process, whole view of simplification. I think this is key. For example, companies are still not clear regarding when you speak about carbon intensity, is it CO2 intensity only or CO2 equivalent intensity, which would mean that we have all greenhouse gases factored in. And this makes a huge difference in the number that you have in the end. So standardization of the basics, I think, is really key to the process. The second point is regarding when we speak about climate change, which should be very clear, it should be the objective of climate change and biodiversity. Because biodiversity is, often seen a little bit lagging behind, and it's really key as, biodiversity is very much impacted by itself by climate change. We need to make sure that both of them, are taken into account by companies. Coming back on the limited assurance and, building capacity for this, I think. And I totally agree with Rami, limited assurance is already a fairly high threshold. And to get there, it will not only be in terms of at least reviewing the methodologies which are described by the companies on the basis of interviews, which by itself is a very good point to make sure are these credible considering the circumstances that the company face. But also, discussing the whole discussion around scope. And when I mean scope, is it the priority? Where do these companies are making the most impact? And especially when you consider the do no significant harm, company will have a tendency to look at the bright side and to forget a little bit about the downside. And the do no significant harm, really here you need a bit of challenge to management to make sure that this is not forgotten in the process and with the right level of emphasis so that there can be that balanced view provided to investors and analysts. So those discussions regarding the scope, is it really where you make an impact, good or bad, that needs to be discussed and what you do to remediate that for the case. And so the scope, understand the impact, and the discussion around do no significant harm, where you need the challenge that external auditors will provide, and this challenge will already be factored in a limited assurance. Final point regarding capacity building, I totally agree. Companies should be free to either choose their independent auditors for financial reporting matters, and there are very good slate of reasons for doing that. Practical, but also better understanding of the articulation between financial and non-financial. This will also help the quality of financial audit overall. Practicality, for sure, this is something that needs to be possible for companies, and they should be free to take maybe for the whole pack or for certain sections which would require more specialized capacities, engineering, science of life science and so on. There you might need some expert companies, and you should be able to have a limited assurance report which would draw on both capacities for either the independent auditor and, if so the company choose, and another expert firm. So I think there should be choice here, and definitely not limit the possibility to use the company's auditors for these reviews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Hélène. Erika, I see that you've lowered your hand. Does that mean you're less, burning to comment, and I can give the floor to Stanislas and Philippe first?
Absolutely. I thought you would moderate it. I enthusiastically raised my hand, but if you moderate it, then I think that's better for the discussions.
So I'm going to throw the ball to Stanislas then.
Thank you. Yeah, very quick comments. We do need yes, standardization of basics, but the definition of basics is not that easy. And maybe I might disagree a bit with Anne-Hélène, although I really agree on most of what you've just said. But I think that biodiversity is very important, but it's very complicated. It's extremely complicated, and we've tried several ways. I think we're making a lot of progress, collective progress, on how to measure impact on biodiversity. But if we mix this right away with core climate, we might get something not as simple as we would like. And it's the same. We have to take into account, of course, do no significant harm, because it's in the green taxonomy. But we know when we look at the taxonomy and the way we can use it, how difficult it makes things, because when you mingle the harm you might do on biodiversity and some other issues with climate, then you lose priorities, and it becomes very complicated for corporates and for investors to really maintain a direction. But on the contrary, when you're talking about CO2, I might advocate for a CO2 equivalent, because there, the carbon equivalent footprint is what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and climate change fight. So, and I know it's very difficult. I know but again, we can go progressively, step by step, and start by CO2 and all that. But again, I think that we should not try to put too much at the same time. And in my opinion, there is really one big priority: CO2 and climate change. And it's much easier than many other issues because it's quantitative, and we can do so. It's easier to incorporate that into accountancy. It's easier to incorporate into financial materiality, all this, and really and feed integrated reports by corporates and all that. So, and I think we can learn a lot with this CO2 equivalent reporting, and we will of course gain for all the rest of ESG issues.
Finally, we've got a little bit of disagreement on this panel, making the life of the moderator a little bit easier. Wonderful. And I see that companies already want to reply. So, Anne-Hélène, I'm going to give you the floor. And then, to settle the disagreement between the two of you, we will ask civil society where they stand.
Well, thank you, Olivier. Very quick response to Stanislas. I think you just bound to consider biodiversity, because when you're looking for solutions on climate change, you just don't want to have investments spent on something which will be put into question in the very in the very close future. So you want to make sure that these solutions are proof, and that it won't damage things, and that you won't invest a lot of money on something which will not be sustainable in the future. So that's why I was saying you need to consider both. And even if I understand the priority on climate change, my point on saying biodiversity is important is to, and I take your point, it's very complex, but you can have some priority on making sure that your solutions, would not damage biodiversity in the process. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. And to make Philippe's life even easier in settling the views between the two of you, there is a great comment actually in Slido which is basically asking whether we're trying to square the circle, wanting simplicity and efficiency at the same time, as well as materiality, quality, and comparability. So easy task, right? Philippe, what do you think?
I believe there's a solution to this indeed. We just need to. I'll try to respond to the conversation between Stanislas and Helen, and then I'll have a remark on the assurance, and maybe I'll bring a little bit of controversy. Let's see about it. But first, on biodiversity, it's all a matter of perspective. If you look at this from the sector agnostic perspective, which is what is being now addressed in the standards, we can't have the same standard as for the climate change or as for the pollution, because we don't have the metrics, and because it's impossible to have a metric that somehow applies to all sectors or biodiversity threats and so on and so forth. Instead, what we need at the sector agnostic level is essentially a disclosure on the risks and on the assessment of the risk by the companies in a very similar fashion as we're considering this for the human rights in the context of human rights due diligence. In fact, the other piece of legislation, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive proposal by the Commission, is also addressing human rights and environment together in the scope of the due diligence. So the tools for the management by the companies, as well as for the disclosure at the very top level, needs to be based on this kind of a risk assessment, and by risk I don't mean only financial risk, but actually risks of adverse impacts and so on. And then we can go to the sector specific stuff, and then we can start identifying concrete metrics that, of course, they are then useful. But this needs to be done on an activity based or sector specific based level, and so on and so forth. Anyways, I'm sharing my views on this. I'm not sharing EFRAG's views. Just to be perfectly clear, I'm just a participant in a much broader project. I'm not involved in the work on the environmental standards. I'm just saying that the key to addressing the biodiversity issues can be seen in the broader context of due diligence and reporting and so on and so forth. We just need to identify what, for that particular entity, for that particular company, what are the perceived risks or drivers and so on and so forth. So much on this one, and then on assurance. Yeah, the key issue here is twofold. One is the assurance will be possible only and good insofar as the reporting standards are good. If the reporting standards are very clear in terms of the methodologies and so on and so forth, and just we're solving most of the problem. There needs to be an assurance standard as well, of course, but I'm just it's a kind of a similar matter as with the GHG protocol and assurance and verification of the GHG emissions. That's one thing. The other thing is that the sustainability expertise is out there, but it's not evenly distributed. And lots of the sustainability expertise is in specialized firms. So this calls for opening the let's say the market for these services a little bit. At the same time, especially the big four auditing firms do have significant sustainability expertise, but again, it's not equally distributed across the market in a way that it really fulfill the needs of the 50,000 European companies. So we need to be a little bit open-minded, and we need to also envisage the collaborations between the accountancy professions and so on and so forth, instead of now claiming or pretending that there is one perfect solution and this will be the solution and everything will adjust to it. We just need to be a little bit more humble in that regard. But that's my take. I won't repeat the arguments for the, let's say, for not splitting and just doing it with the if I may say so, statutory auditors. I mean, the arguments for that have been said. There are pros and cons, and it's a complicated discussion. But I would, on this, if I understood you correctly, Ellen, I would side with your point of view on this one.
Thanks, Philippe. There's always pros and cons in life, and that's the job of policymakers to mitigate the cons and optimize the pros. So I think we've heard, to your point, actually, Philippe, I see, on the market for talent, I think it's just crazy. It's very difficult to find the people you're talking about. They're not spread evenly, but there are not a lot of them as well, I believe. So it is quite a difficult issue. And I think we've also heard calls for integration, no difference between what is financial and what is sustainable. Stanislas, I don't know whether you have a comment on that before I pass on the floor to Eric to share his notes actually on this whole conversation and what he's going to bring back to the trilogues.
No, not really.
Okay, very good. So, Eric, you've got even more time to tell us what's your take on this conversation.
Well, I was mentally prepared to say something about assurance, but then we moved into other domains like the need for standardization, which is essential, I think, and I would agree to that. But then Stanislas made the comments that, yeah, but for some areas that may be easy, like for climate and for other subject matters, sustainability subject matters that may be more difficult, which is probably true as well. If things are simple and measurable, then I think also the assurance will be relatively simple. So, and the end game, by the way, is reasonable assurance. I saw it was one of the questions in the chat. I mean, we start with limited assurance, but the end game would be reasonable assurance. Looking at those the standards, the CSRDs that are developed, sometimes I think. We all say that things should be as simple as possible, but not simpler, the infamous quote from Einstein. But what if the subject matter is very complex? And maybe some of these sustainability issues are very complex, and how simple can things be if the underlying phenomena that we want to report on have endless causal relationships? I do something here and not there. So I think there's an inherent tension, probably squaring the circle between, yes, simplicity, we all want simplicity, but if the subject matter is complex, would simplicity by itself not do harm, to use that word, to the phenomena that we want to report on? Cutting back to assurance, what for me would be very important is actually a kind of precise wording of what the opinion would be on the assurance. So what will it be? What are the words that the assurance provider or the auditor would actually put his signature under? Would it be something that the management report, assuming that it will be integrated, which would be fine, actually, the management report or a separate report to be seen. Would the auditor or the assurance provider sign something off along the lines of that the management report provides a fair presentation of the sustainability impacts or the material sustainability impacts, risk and opportunities in accordance with ESRS 1, with ESRS? Will it be something like that? I think that's also something that we probably need to reflect on. What is the precise wording? Because the precise wording will determine the amount of work that the assurance provider or the auditor has to do. So that's one comment. On the splitting, yes, there are pros and cons. If the splitting proposed by the European Parliament is to achieve a less market concentration, then obviously we can understand that, but you have to ask yourself whether that's the right tool to achieve that, because there may be downsides in inefficiency. Probably the incremental work that the existing auditor of the financial statements has to do to provide also assurance on the sustainability report, it will probably be less and easier compared to when it would be another provider of the insurance services. I took many more notes, but but this is kind of my summary of what I scribbled down.
Well, thank you very, very much, Eric. I think you did a fantastic job, actually, in kind of closing, summarizing this wonderful panel. which unfortunately I'm going to have to gradually drive to a close. But I see that that's the beauty of having a great panel. There was much appetite to continue the conversation, although there was a lot of agreement actually in this panel. But so to drive this to a close, I would like to first of all thank you, the panelists. I think you really did a splendid job. I'd like to thank actually the audience, but also send a big apology to the audience, because they've been a fantastic audience, even if we didn't see them, because they were firing questions all the time. And I don't think we really had a chance to answer each and every question. And finally, I would very much like to thank ACCA, who's been our partner in organizing this event, and the All Accountancy Europe and ACCA team who have been making this event possible. A very interesting event from which I would like to keep a number of key points in mind. I think, Eric, your initial words will stick with me. Climate is not waiting. And I think that's something that all of us should keep in our mind. I'm sure that Rami's calls for simplicity will be remembered as well. And I think it is important to note that the accountancy profession is primarily concerned by simplicity, because it is a cause of efficiency. And it's clear that this call for simplicity was, I think, unanimously supported. On the same line, I think we had from Stanislas in particular this idea that in order to be effective, we probably need less information, but very, very quickly. And then gradually over time, we can have more information later. But I like that because I think it is really putting into perspective how we need to address the climate challenge, which is what we're trying to do collectively. We're not trying to do reporting for the sake of reporting. We're trying to do reporting to give our old days and our children a chance of living in a not too destroyed world. And I would like also to note, especially Anne-Hélène's call, for not only standardization of the basics, I think that's also along the same line, but also I think she made a fantastic comment on the need for integration. There is no such thing as on the one hand a planet and on the other hand a finance planet, right? It's one and the same, and it's the one that we share. We've got only one planet, and to effectively manage our planet, it is critically important that we manage both finance and sustainability into a fully integrated way. I hope I have not betrayed any of the speakers. Again, I'm sorry for the audience that we couldn't answer the loads of fantastic questions that you sent. And again, a big thank you to our partners and members from ACCA, and to a wonderful, although very consensual panel. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.